So this is my commentary on Proverbs chapter 22. I left off last time with verse 24. I plan to continue with verse 25. Lest you learn his ways and get a snare to your soul. Now, I had mentioned earlier in the previous episode that at times the Proverbs are this strange, snake-like thing. I don't mean that in a derogatory sense. I mean that in the windy sort of way, where a snake slithers. It has various bends to it, or I could say it's much like a trail, such that there are many different winds and bends in it. And sometimes verses as they are stand alone. Sometimes one verse may flow into another. Sometimes it's quite clear when this happens, and sometimes it's difficult to tell when it happens. Ultimately, I think that there's a continual through line through which somebody can draw some common thread through. Now, this verse that we are starting with is one of those verses that comes off of a verse prior. Verse 24, make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man you shall not go, lest you learn his ways and get a snare to your soul. And so it seems clear that it is a trail on to the last. Now, I don't necessarily want to go into verse 24 again in detail, the type of detail that I did on the last episode, but I will have to mention a degree of it, some themes from the last reflection, in order to have some understanding going forward into this verse. So again, make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man you shall not go, lest you learn his ways and get a snare to your soul. Now, my interpretation of verse 24 is, and has to do with, the spirit of man. And so I think it's going to take a little bit of time to outline what that conception is, or at least my conception of the spirit. And I've used a number of different analogies throughout the Proverbs for what I'm building as this spirit, my definition of it anyway. And it has to do with an extension of himself. The Spirit is an extension of himself. The Spirit I do consider to be something that is different from the soul, but all the same it is connected to it. It's sort of a strange relationship I think that it has to it. But nonetheless, this Spirit is, when I say it is an extension of the person, it is not a physical extension, obviously. The Spirit is within the domain of the cognitive sphere, within the sphere of mind. It is something that, within the comprehension of existence, he extends himself. And it's this strange world that man has entered into, because he both inhabits the physical world, but also the conceptual, that in which something is able to be grasped by something else. And because he finds himself here, or perhaps not because he finds himself here, but as he finds himself here, he also finds himself aware of himself. And so we have a being that is capable of action in the world, but also able to reflect on its own experience and be aware of its own experience. Quite a complicated thing. Now, this spirit of his as I've said, is an extension of himself, extension of that mind. It is the way in which, I would say, within this network of mind space, we can say, the Spirit is the way that he walks. It is, perhaps that's not the best analogy, for I think his soul carries him, but his spirit is almost like his eyes, perhaps, within this domain, but it is more than just well, no, I will say it's the eyes. It's the eyes, and by extension, it is that extension of his attention, because much like his physical existence, in which he is required to pay attention to the environment, the degree to which he pays attention to the environment is the degree to which he interacts with it, essentially. If he does not pay attention to the stream down the road, he will not interact with it. It is very unlikely that he will interact with it. Now, in the case of there being no buildings or anything, he will interact with a stream if he pays attention to it for water. And man has this capacity. In modern society, I think it's corrupted a little bit in the sense that there are so many different things that one can pay attention to, and yet it can be quite passive. It could be quite, this seems negative in a sense, but observatory. It loses the attention, and its directness, I think, loses some of its purpose. And as a result, it takes a greater degree of will to find that purpose. Make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man you shall not go. Spirit. Within friendship, the spirit finds its place. It finds its attention. Within this type of relation, within this type of bond, the spirit finds a purpose. It finds something to see, something to look at, something that is valuable to it. And through that avenue, the avenue by which it seems and feels as though it could traverse, it goes through this passage. With it, it drags along with the trail back home, back to the soul. It encapsulates that thing by which it pays attention, and of course, to a lesser degree, the things around it. Like if we are friends with a particular person, we know all about their experiences, but we don't necessarily experience as they experience. They have their own lives. They are themselves. And so we have some relationship and some connection to the people around them, and to the objects that are around them, to the space that they live. But again, this spirit is not necessarily most strongly attending to that space around our friend. It is strongly attending to our friend, if we are genuine, of course, if the relationship is genuine. Assuming that the relationship is genuine, that we are attending to our friend, we are attending to many different aspects of our friend, as we have many different aspects that produce who we are. Now, I will not necessarily say that concretely this anger of the friend in question makes up his soul, but it makes up a part of him that is so close, I think, to his soul that it's almost impossible to separate. And because of this, his disposition and his behavior just is filtered through those emotions. The heart and the reason have decided to take a holiday together, a holiday to hell, a holiday to fire. And because of this fire, because of this heat, something that is symbolic of something that is intolerable or unbearable, something that corrupts our experience, this flows back through that passageway and meets us at home where we are vulnerable, at home where the virus can infect us. And in this way, we shouldn't make friends with the angry person. Now, the second part of that verse, and with a furious man you shall not go, is an extension of that, although it's not completely the same. I would refer to the previous episode for that conversation. Lest you learn his ways and get a snare to your soul. So, perhaps we have to discuss the furious man. But I think what I've set up here from that previous verse leads us in that direction of verse 25, lest you learn his ways and get a snare to your soul. It is because of this landscape that we are creating. It's because that we are the intelligible creatures that walk the earth. Or perhaps rather I should say that we are the creatures that have a relatively high degree of the capacity to consider that which is intelligible. I'll say that. And because of that, we have created, or we find ourselves in, there's two different ways I suppose to think about it. The traditional way is to say that we find ourselves in the intelligible sphere, something that is created beyond us. I suppose the other needs not much mention, for I'm concerned with the traditional sort. Lest you learn his ways and get a snare to your soul. Now, I think the idea and the conception of the way in which this plays out is accurate. Now, of course, this is my visualization. It may be visualized or analogized in a few different ways, or many different ways. There are many different minds with many different ways of seeing that can put these pieces together. But so far I have this image in my head. And because of this, I'm concerned primarily now about the word learn, to learn. Because it's obvious, given this illustration, how the anger comes into us, or how the virus comes to affect us. The virus that tempts our heart and steals our reason, such that we certainly fall victim to it. But there is a way in which we learn, as the verse goes. And so what does it mean if I'm conceptualizing this as something that is bad, which surely it is if we are being instructed against it? It means that we can learn bad things. That's of course an obvious statement, but it's interesting in this context to say it in that way. That we can learn bad things. That we can learn his ways of anger. But it's not necessarily just one thing. And so when we say his ways, there's a plurality there. There's a culmination of experience, a boundary or a net of intelligibility by which we can identify something that is the way in which he goes. One of which is certainly behavior. Second is probably the way he thinks. thirdly is probably the way that he feels, and those are in no particular order. Now, of course, all of those have some relationship to one another. I should probably mention that today is a new day, and I'm going to take this in a slightly different direction, because I've been finding, especially lately, that it seems that all proper things take time. They take time to build, they take time to experience. There is no instant gratification on the path to true meaning and purpose. And so I was thinking about that previous recording, and I can see where I was going. And it's a matter of now expanding this landscape, this artistic landscape. In my mind, literally, I'm thinking about an open plain, something that is bare, something that needs some color, something that needs to be explored, perhaps. And I think about this landscape in the context of this potential danger that we are talking about. That it is possible to learn the ways of the wicked. Here we're talking about angry, we're talking about furious. Even in the absence of other people, if I find myself here in my mind where it's generally safe. Although certainly that cannot be true, because this open landscape to the individual is just as dangerous as to the landscape that is shared by one and by others. And so the question is, well, since we are now we have been prompted to consider the possibility that we can learn the ways of evil. We can learn the ways of the wicked, or of those that have been corrupted by something, by some experience, or by some decision that they have made, some commitment. And I think at this point, since I have explored in some detail, or reiterated rather, what I was considering in terms of the extension of the self, or the extension of the spirit, the spirit, I think I may have said this already, but the spirit is woven in many different fabrics. Some have a particular purpose of catching within its net particular items, particular concepts, particular objects, perhaps. Other forms of our spiritual fabric have woven into it more sophisticated and more valuable threads. And these we choose to throw around things that we love, we find valuable. And without going back into verse 24, I would like to make a broader, general statement. Because I think, unlike the fisherman who deliberately casts his nets, there's an aspect of us that we just do not have control over where our spirit goes. I think there's an aspect of us that does have some control. But of the things that we are exposed to, many of this will find the fabric of our spirit without, perhaps without us being aware of it. But where I was going was without our desire of it. Situations evolve, they move. What we had once thought, or the reason that we had once approached this thing, this person, whatever, was one way and then we found it to be another. This certainly can happen, and it can happen not because of the person or of the institution, the experience, whatever it might have been, was bad in of itself, but rather, as the experience progressed, somehow there was a corruptive element that got in. Now, I'm saying that to expand this landscape a little bit, to give it some color. We're thinking about possibilities. We're thinking about the spirit, the aspect of mind by which we take in information. That there is this sense of us that is beyond us. Again, like the extension of the car. It is us, but it is a projection. And this projection is something that we use to navigate the landscape. A projection of our identity, the projection of ourselves beyond the interior, beyond within the mind. But I'm not really sure about that distinction, beyond within the mind. It sounds a bit off. It seems like a layer or a filter, much like the heart is one of the filters of our experience. Sometimes it's difficult to understand exactly how the heart acts as a filter, especially where to place the self versus where the soul is. There is some connection, surely, from the soul to self. The heart is a massive component of the self, at least I consider it to be. And so, it's almost as if the self is a filter for the soul, or rather the soul is filtered through the self, that then this intelligible bedrock, or framework, or foundation is then able to be experienced. But anyway, back to the spirit. The spirit as an extension of the solidified self, perhaps, the securely walled self. You know, I've been thinking lately, especially when one starts to, as I have been, reading through these Proverbs and really reflecting on myself and of my relationships and things, when I enter into the experiences that I'm reflecting on, or similar ones, the reflection and the memory of the reflection comes back. And I analyze my behavior, and I realize how much better things can be if I acted in a particular way, or if I engaged in a particular manner. But also I understand that there are layers of myself that if I get warmed up, let's say, whether it be a physical sort of thing or a cognitive sort of thing, as in the case of conversing with a friend or just hanging out with friends. Initially, when I get there, it is not, and when I start to communicate it, it's not something that is all that meaningful, perhaps. The experience and the connectedness that we have is surely there, but it develops over time, and as the experience and the time moves past, and we get warmed up, whatever that means, we get comfortable, we get loosened up, we relax, and we share perhaps more of our spirit. The fibers become that we shoot out are a little bit more valuable every time. What we are pushing out into that intelligible sphere is more of our personal inner workings. We're shooting that out into the car space, into the extended space by which somebody else can share and occupy, co-pilot. And this is surely another image of this landscape that is being illustrated here. But also the same happens to us. That when other people become comfortable, threads are thrown around us, and we are within their realm, their domain, within the embrace of their spirit. So I suppose what I'm getting at here is that within the open space, regardless of who is around, it behooves us to be careful, to be judicious, discerning about the way in which we behave, because our behavior is that the way in which the spirit is communicated. It's all sorts of different things that are wound up within behavior. Our gestures, our relative level of arousal, our attentiveness, the way that our dialogue, our communication, our cadence, all of this communicates something. Something within a realm, within a domain of mind, upon that landscape of intelligibility that may be unknown to the inner self, to the inner thoughts, to the perceived central of the individual. Now, this is a landscape that I think will be returned to. There are plenty of such landscapes that have been put forth here during this experience of analyzing the Proverbs, and I think this is another one to add. Be not you one of them that strike hands, or of them that are sureties for debts. So I'm debating whether or not to enter into this proverb as I have most usually with other verses. This, at least the first half of this verse, seems to be one of those that's straightforward. I've said oftentimes that sometimes the most straightforward verses are the ones that give the information that's unexpected. I think because the expectation is that it is straightforward and that it is readily understandable, and perhaps it may be, but upon greater time and reflection, things seem to come out. Again, the Proverbs, even if they are simple, they are meant to prompt us into that landscape of mind for which we can create, we can discover, we can intuit. And as we do so, we come to some understanding about the world, but we have to be very careful as we do it, not to fall into error. And it is not like other forms of knowing or of testing, because within this landscape we are open, we are free. So, with that, I think I'm going to avoid the urge to gloss over this. Now, when I say gloss over it, I still would have given it an effort to interpret it and to find what meaning there is. So we have two aspects of the verse here. I think the melody of the verse is important. We are being asked not to do or not to be two things. Now, to be is an interesting thing. To be or to not to be, of course, is the famous saying. But being by itself implies the aspect of soul, for the soul is the seat of our being. The seat of our being, I suppose there are many ways that we can conceptualize it. This is, when we say seat of being or just being in general, this is something that is fundamental to all of experience. Of course, as I speak into this microphone, I'm considering my own experience, the human experience. As I consider it, I think of all of the other forms of experience out there in the world that don't have the same type of experience that I have, or the same type of capacity to self-reflect and to be aware of their experience. I think that there are beings on this earth that are capable of it, perhaps to a less sophisticated degree. I think there are forms of information transmission that transcend what I am capable of perceiving at the current moment. But just because they're beyond my perception, it doesn't mean that they occupy the same space as the human mind does. And when I say space, I don't necessarily mean the intelligible sphere, because that's an all-encompassing thing, but I mean more so of a like kind, that we can relate on the same level. I think man has an interesting way of relating to other beings on the planet that are more like him, and I think of the difference between those beings and beings like trees, which are living things that have aspects of communication networks, just as the human being does. All the same, I consider these things beings. And to be remains a difficult question for me. There are plenty of places I can go here. I'm trying to find the most judicious, so I'm not wasting too much time or expending thought that can be used elsewhere. But if I'm just to stay in the human context, and I'm to consider this being of mine, this experience, I'm a relatively young man. I'm as healthy as I probably ever will be. I'm at the peak of my experience, one could say. My mind is healthy enough to maintain a coherent self. I am not diseased in any way. My belly is full, and my being and my experience at this moment is quite pleasant. There are many things that I think can occur that can either erode my experience as it is, as I find it now, or also improve it. But my being at the base level, I think in some sense extends beyond my heart or my reason. Or perhaps I should say, it precedes my heart or my reason. Much like my being as I existed in the state of infancy, my reason was not well developed. Perhaps my feelings were, to a degree. But yet I was a being, and I was experiencing. Perhaps even before I was able to determine what my feelings were, or to express myself based on some discharge of neurotransmitters from the nerve terminals. Before this experience was heavily integrated, before I was born and still in the womb, I was still a being. I was still something that was alive. Certainly in different form. And this is what I was getting at earlier about the thought of just thinking of different forms of different beings, and yet they are beings, although their experience is different. And I say all of that just to say that I think being precedes the individual conscious mind, that of the individual human being, the individual human conscious mind. There are two paths I think that we can go here. I think that there is the path in which we disregard time as something that is experienced as the human being experiences it. And I think also that we can move down the path in which experience is made manifest by prior experience. I think there are plenty of ways in which that is obvious. There must be experience of some type for a woman to get pregnant, for my mother to get pregnant, such that I would then become something. Before her, the process occurred again. Before the processes that would be recognizably human, they occurred in other forms and other beings. Before they occurred in other forms and in other beings, it formed from at least what we suspect to be of simpler elements that have come together to form something complex. The point here is not necessarily to highlight the process from simplicity to increasing complexity, for I'm not certain if it is the case that it has always been the case that something that is simple creates something that is more complex, or if you can start with something that is both simple and complex, or at least contain both elements, such that the simplicity produces some complexity. But it's neither the simplicity that comes before the complexity, nor the complexity before the simplicity. The two are in tandem together. Now, of course, this is an assertion. This is something that I have come to without supporting it in some way. It is a hypothesis, perhaps. Perhaps I can't consider it a hypothesis. But I think that there's an element of reason that I've tried to follow here to make it make sense, or to allow it to make sense. I think that the reasoning is relatively shallow in terms of its supports. But oftentimes I think I find with this type of exploration is that given an assertion and the flashlight of the conscious mind, there tends to be interesting connections that can be drawn, even if one rejects the initial assertion. So let's forget for a moment the truthfulness or the falsehood of the statement that complexity and simplicity live together in some relationship. The reason I think that this is important is because our origin story often involves these points of creation, or sparks. We can think about the Big Bang. We can think about the creation of man in the story of Genesis, which can be interpreted in many different ways. The way in which I tend to reject is that translation in which there was a point in Earth's history that all of a sudden man came out of the physical substrate without any causal relationships. I think that the way that man came to be was through a causal chain. A chain that was set in motion by an experience, by something that existed prior to his experience. And I think that even the conception of speaking of man's conception in terms of before and after is part of the problem. For before and after, in the mind of the unification of complexity and simplicity, doesn't exist. If we keep on following that chain, we find ourselves back to the point in which we ask ourselves, well, what happened before this? What happened before that? And so, what I said earlier about this causal chain for man to come to be, I think it is right. But I think it is right based on our perceptions, the way in which we see the world. We see things causally. And it's not to say that causal patterns are not true. They most certainly are true. Most of our observations and our understanding of the world that we find ourselves in are because of our observations about causal relationships. But just because we can identify causal relationships or some chain of cause and effect, and I should be careful here, because I think often, I see this in my own experience, that the recognition of some pattern exists at a certain level. Just like, as I mentioned earlier at the outset about being, it's quite clear that being exists at different levels. I think observation and perception occurs at different levels. The way in which the world is experienced, the way in which a being interfaces with it, occurs at different levels. I think it is possible for a being to understand the possibility that his experience and his perception of reality is constrained by the way that he is afforded the experience. And if he is understanding of such things, he has a strange meta-relationship to the possibility of experience that is more than his current level or interface. That there are plenty of ways of interfacing with reality in the world, of taking in and synthesizing information that would provide a different picture. And that's not to say that the picture that he has is false. It can certainly be the case that everything, well, maybe not everything, but many of the things that he considers about the world, the things that he has observed and learned from wherever, may be accurate descriptions of the world. Accurate, but limited. And I think we know that, much like at night, if we are to go outside in a darkened area and shine a flashlight into the woods, let's say, the woods has a strange way of lighting up the immediate, reflecting the immediate light on the available branches that are in front of us. But there is this almost impenetrable darkness that extends beyond a certain point, where this flashlight is great at illuminating at a certain distance, but beyond it, it's very difficult for the mind, or the eyes, to perceive what is beyond the light. And it provides this strange, surreal experience, and the thought that there is something always beyond that which the eye can see, which there is. And then the mind thinks about it, and it perseverates, and it considers that potentially what is beyond is danger, and it's important that we understand and that we can be prepared for danger. But that's sort of an aside. But the point of all of this is to highlight that this is an aspect of man's experience in particular. And that if we were to imagine the whole of experience, the whole of intelligibility, some of the fundamental supports man's place on the earth, and I mean that separately from the world. The earth has a physical manifestation of his experience. Perhaps I can go farther and say it supports his it's difficult to put this into words, but perhaps it supports the self, supports the mind that has come to be, that necessarily is unified in such a way to have that self, the self that depends on time, depends on close relationships, finds the pattern of life and death inescapable because it is for him. There are certain fundamentals that apply to him that may not apply to just general experience outside of himself. And although he may be aware that this is something that is possible, that experience outside of himself exists, that things, ideas, concepts, people will transcend his own life and carry on into the next. He may even conceptualize as the life to come, or the life to be, as the experience of another man, perhaps, sort of this reincarnate sense, or as the experience of an animal, whatever. But of the totality, again, going back to the simplicity and complexity that dance as they exist together, as those concepts exist beyond us, they exist beyond time, they exist beyond the constraints of man's experience. And the experience beyond man's experience is a bit meta, and it is something that is interesting to reflect on, given that I am aware of my finite experience, given that there is this sort of lament that comes from not being a being that is able to appreciate existence as a broader whole than I am aware of. But all the same, I do occupy being. I do occupy an aspect. My experience, as large or as small as I may find it to be, large in some sense because compared to many other mammals on this planet, it's not as though we have a plethora of other beings that we can be in exchange with that would be of the level of another person. But as I am a being, as they are beings, and as beings beyond me are beings beyond me, we occupy our levels, our spaces, almost like a large, massive, concrete, inverted sphere in which there are rows and rows and rows of these concrete slabs that are almost like a beautiful frame that surrounds a painting, and within every frame there is this experience, this intelligible experience. But of the whole, of all of these experiences, they are connected at some central point. And this central point is, I think, limiting in and of itself, because it is not just the separation of all of these experiences, it is these experiences. That although the individual experiences may consider themselves to be individual, but to the extent that they are experiences, the experience or the soul, the being, is beyond them. It is something that is a part of a broader experience that understands its experience independent of the parts. And so again, there is this bizarre interplay of experiences at different levels. So being, as I've conceptualized it in this framework, we are suggested to be not one of them that strike hands. And it's hard to come down from the idea that we are connected to experience by a unified experience. And then somehow understand that at this level we ought to do one thing or another. Because what does that even mean? How can there possibly be something that would direct the aspects? Perhaps the aspects have some important relationship to the experience of the larger whole. And if the aspects have some relationship, if they have some sway, they have some influence, perhaps the larger whole will be aware when the aspects are doing things that are contrary to experience. If something is contrary to experience, it is nothing. That it is self-destructive. It is the opposite of creation. Again, it is destruction. It is death. And I've mentioned in an earlier proverb, I wish I remember which one it was, but it was a beautiful prompting into just this. It was asking us to consider the the realm of death, the realm of the ending, the realm of the nothingness. And to reflect on where this nothingness would be, it's likely to be nowhere. It is only something that is, I think, possible. This is an extension, or perhaps this is an overextension on my part. But it seems that nothingness is only possible given something that can conceptualize of nothingness. Nothingness is not aware of nothingness. And so, to be not is a contradiction in terms. But since man, as we understand it, has this freedom of will, his not being would be to suggest that he ought not to behave such that at the end of his behavior, it is suggesting that he prefers nothingness over somethingness. And I think that extends into this striking hands portal, perhaps we could say, that we are prompted to consider, because if we strike hands with something, or with somebody, we are developing a relationship that leads to nothingness, that leads to destruction, decay, to death. Although this is a natural part of life and experience in this paradoxical sense, to willfully and deliberately move the experience that we have, that we are a part of, on some limiting or unjust or imprisoning, or I think of like a black hole type of thing. It's this sucking away of experience into this agreement that opens up this, striking hands, this handshake, this agreement over something that dilutes the possibility of experience, perhaps, that moves us away from experience in general. The next part of this verse, or of them that are sureties for debts. So today is a new day, as always, or as it has been of late, somewhat of an abrupt transition. So I mentioned that the day has come anew because it will take me some time to get back to where I would like to be in terms of discussing this verse. Now, initially, when I had read verse 26, admittedly, I interpreted the striking of hands in a somewhat different manner than I ultimately concluded. The striking of hands, this seems to be, to strike something seems to be a violent action. And I don't necessarily think that striking hands is some basic handshake. It certainly is more than a greeting. Now, of course, in a greeting there is some force that's required to shake the hands, but this is not something that we would consider to be a strike. A strike is something it's more forceful. It is a hit. It is a pound. A blow. And although it doesn't necessarily mean to imply something that is out of anger, or something that is intended to do harm, but rather, I think it is important that we keep in mind, or that I keep in mind, that this striking of hands is a forceful type of agreement. It is a physical gesture that is meant to symbolize some agreement. Or rather, that the agreement that is being made is substantial. It is forceful. Be not you one of them that strike hands, or of them that are sureties for debts. Now, just listening to that last bit of audio from yesterday, I think that there is more that can be said here. That surely it's possible that the striking of hands may lead to some unfortunate situation. There's an imbalance of terms. One side has made out far better than the other. And because of this, it is like the second half of the verse, in which there is this responsibility or obligation that is taken on by an individual. That individual then may have overextended themselves and now be in a place to be responsible for somebody else's poor choices. But the difficulty that I have at this point, looking at this with fresh eyes, and I apologize if I have been through this already, but given that I have introduced this concept of being and the relatedness of this being to the broader whole, at this time I find some difficulty placing the strike of hands. And that is to say that I feel as though there is a certain lack of context that I am tripping over. Because I can imagine this striking of hands being something that, again, is like a forceful agreement. Forceful in what way, though, is an interesting question. Forceful, perhaps, in terms of the gravity of the decisions that are being agreed upon. The question is, well, what type of agreement are we being prompted to consider? Now, since we have the second half of the verse, I think that there is at least something that we can go off of. Although I do feel as though I'm missing something about the first verse, even in my initial assessment. The reflection that within the be not, whether it be a direction or an absolute, that because of the way that we choose to orient ourselves to reality, orienting ourselves in such a way that we use our experience to, as I've said earlier, it's hard to put this into words, but to dissolve potential, to dissolve creation, to reduce it, not necessarily to understand, but to reduce it in order to decrease its inherent value. The road to nothingness, of course, at the end of it is nothing. It is a road that just winds and twists without ever coming to any conclusion, because its conclusion is nothing. And since something must be, all we have is that road to nothingness, the unproductive road. And there must be something within the definition of striking hands beyond this conception of some forceful agreement that we are being prompted to consider, and perhaps to define in our minds, that this striking of hands it has to do with this endless chase, at the end of which is nothing of value. In fact, the road itself is the process of devaluing, such that as we approach the end, whether that be death or whatever, death of the self, that we have given up everything about life and of our experience that makes it meaningful and makes it purposeful. This is somehow wound up within the striking of hands. The last thing that I would say, and perhaps this is potentially the most important piece of information that I can add here as an addendum, that it is surely possible that this verse 26 in chapter 22 of the Proverbs, is a follow-on from the verse that was prior. Now this chapter itself is a strange one, because there is continuity clear continuity. Some verses are independent, although there always is an aspect of continuity that goes through chapter to chapter. Even the entire book, there is a continuity to it. But as I was talking about earlier, there are these layers or levels to continuity. And sometimes, as is the case in some of the earlier verses that I've discussed in this chapter, they directly relate to the ones that either precede or follow. And if that is to be the case, the context would be ample to understand that the striking of hands is not just some agreement, some mutual understanding, but it is actually some agreement or mutual understanding to the angry man, to the furious man, to the man that would set a snare in our souls. And so there's a lot to be said here. There's a lot of different ways in which this verse can be interpreted. I tend to think the added context, given the verses prior, helps a lot. But it's not necessary to imagine why it would be the case that one should not be of the type to strike hands with somebody. At the very least, to realize, even if this is not an absolute, in the sense that there are situations and cases in which coming to an agreement is fundamental, is necessary. And it is also the case that striking hands with somebody, making this agreement, is also opening a window to the soul. It is opening potential for our soul to be abused, perhaps, by somebody else's experience or poverty therein. But to finish this verse, sureties for debts. I think the productive road to go here, outside of what I've said about taking on somebody else's responsibilities, is to explore what responsibility is in and of itself. This is an exercise that I've done before. I think it's going to be a useful one to conduct now. Now, I'd like to, before I get into the word responsibility, to outline again why I want to go down this road. Now, a surety is something of an acceptance of responsibility. It is the taking on of one's prior obligation. They do so out of many different reasons, I am sure. If it is someone that we care about, perhaps it's because we don't want to see them suffer. We don't want to see them overly burdened by debts. Debt's one of the principal things by which the modern man is enslaved. And it would seem that between this obligation and the person that is the guarantor, that vouches for the person that perhaps is lacking, or they require the necessary funds to purchase something. Because of this backing, they have been given confidence. The reputation is also on the line on the part of the person that guarantees the reliability of the person that they are putting forth. or propping up. This obligation is an interesting thing in and of itself, let alone the responsibility to the obligation. The two seem to go hand in hand. It is much like something that is found in nature. It is found within us, actually. Anatomically, within the shoulder, we have a few different articulating pieces that make up this shoulder complex. We have the scapula, we have the clavicle, we have the humerus, scapula articulating with the posterior aspect of our ribs and the thorax, and the clavicle articulating with the sternum, that centerpiece of the axial skeleton. All of these components work together to raise the arm overhead, to reach forward, to provide a stable base for which we can manipulate objects. Between the articulation between the humerus and the scapula, there are numerous connections of muscles and ligaments and nerves that run through and run past that structure. Numerous other things, arteries, veins, lymphatic vessels. Within the joint complex, let's say, if we were just sort of to imagine the arthrology, just the humerus as it articulates with the scapula, the ball at the head of the humerus fitting into that glenoid cavity or socket. It is surrounded by this fibrous joint capsule. That fibrous joint capsule is continuous with some of the tendons of the rotator cuff muscles. The rotator cuff muscles, as the word would suggest, form a cuff around these two bony surfaces to provide stability for the joint. Even further, there are ligaments to provide stability for the joint, a joint that has a high level or a high degree of freedom. It is highly mobile. The head of the humerus, twice as large as the cavity that it sits in. The joint itself is quite unstable, if not for both the passive elements, being the tendons and ligaments, but also the contractile elements, being the muscles, namely the rotator cuff, that provides strong stability to the shoulder. But the attention here I want to be guided towards the continuous nature in which the tendons of the rotator cuff muscles blend in with the joint capsule of the glenohumeral joint. In this way, I am considering the blending of responsibility into obligation. That this responsibility gives stability to the joint that would be considered the agreement or the striking of hands. And the reason that there is need for this responsibility or for this stability in the agreement is because of the force of the agreement, is because of the forces that are placed through the shoulder joint, that it is necessary to have some restraining element to maintain the integrity of the relationship between those two surfaces. It's fundamental to the maintenance of the relationship between individuals to have an obligation met with some sense of responsibility, because that obligation is the expression of force. It is the expression of the agreement, of the transaction. There is this requirement that is now placed on the individual that has undergone the agreement. And so in this way, I think that the responsibility is fundamental to understand. Within the word responsibility, I see the word response. I've described this before, but within response, also within the word respect, there is this fundamental component in the etymological sense of a calling back to, or of a response, responding back to something. That RE component, that backwards or looking back. And I think within this conception, or this ability to respond, we have the capacity to be something. The ability is a capacity to be. We are able to respond. And since we are bound by something, we are obliged to fulfill something. This response, then, is called of us. It is, in a sense, there are many different ways, I think, in which an agreement or some response can manifest, can burden one's life. A lot of this, I think, depends on the other party that's involved. Surely there are plenty of agreements for which they can be made. There can be obligations, but the obligations may not be met. And due to the nature of the agreement, there may not be much of it. In other situations, in cases of debts, for example, this could be a profound threat to one's physical well-being if debts aren't paid, or to their financial well-being, and by extension, perhaps their physical well-being. Now, I'd like to run through the primary thought that I wanted to get to here. We are considering a surety. We are considering an extension, much like I described in earlier verses, that the Spirit can, especially in the case of a friendship or some relationship, any relationship, there's an extension of Spirit, like there is an extension of ourselves to surround our car. And it is not necessary that when we pass something with our car or go around something, that our ability to perceive our surroundings is restricted to the physical body. For if it were, it would be impossible to tell or to determine if we were close to hitting something. We would just sort of hit it, because we would perceive that the object is not close to our body, but the object is close to the car. And so we have this extension of self, this extension of awareness. And in a like manner, the Spirit is an extension of our being, in a way, extension of the soul. This net of intelligibility that surrounds all of that which we relate to, so we can navigate the environment that we find ourselves in. Now, this is a highly conceptual and imprecise definition, but this is okay. This is the type of reason that we are engaged in here. In this manner, with this in mind, a surety is much like a person driving a car. They are responsible for navigating this car around the obstacles. If a person is turning left, and it is a one-lane street, the people that want to go straight have to go around the person that is turning left. In order to do that, they have to navigate the car. If they are unable to navigate the car, they will run into the person. There will be an accident. There will be chaos. There will be this collision. There will be further obligations, further responsibilities for which we are answerable to. And in the case of the surety, we are extending ourselves around the person that made the initial agreement in the first place. It's almost as if we are in the passenger seat, but we are taking responsibility for the driver. And so, because it is this diluted sense of the Spirit, that our spirit surrounds somebody, their spirit takes little threads of what we have extended to them with their net of intelligibility to surround their relationship and their obligations. And undoubtedly, because we are caught up in that web, we would then be also caught up within whatever unfortunate circumstance, or of the striking of hands that was made with the furious man or the angry man in friendship, that this snare that was caught in the soul of the person that was that we made, or that we developed this, however the word is used, developed the surety with or for. This person, by extension, extends that snare unto us, because now we have to deal with their obligations. We are now the primary, we are the person that is answerable for their relations. And so there is this implication here that the self is important, that there is this willful self-autonomy that is required when we are making decisions. Now, I think that there are ways in which guaranteeing something for somebody is important. Like I said, in the case of profound love or profound friendship that is made outside of pure anger, or friendship that is made outside of the situation that we find in verse 24, make no friendship with an angry man, and with a furious man you shall not go. Assuming that our relationships are made in good faith, perhaps the verse that I'm considering here doesn't apply, because we are willing to make the sacrifice. We are willing to be responsible for the potential negative outcomes that can come from extending our spirit beyond the immediate into the secondary and the tertiary. Perhaps I should say that it still applies, but given that we are willfully taking on that surety for those that we love, perhaps the situation is a bit different. But this is the thing about the Proverbs. What we are concerned with here is the relative sophistication, or the relatively sophisticated contextual cues that we are given, because it's possible that we have the capacity, the ability to love a person that is steeped in anger, as in verse 24. And I think that this sort of thing can blind us. We can then fall into this security, or this surety relationship, this guarantor relationship with this person. Whereas true love, perhaps, is allowing the person to see the true reality of the obligations that they have set for themselves, rather than to take it from them and share or bear that responsibility. It's tough, but it seems more obvious in cases like this, less obvious in cases of love that is outside of this, that doesn't include the relationship to this angry or furious person. If you have nothing to pay, why should he take away your bed from under you? You know, I've been doing some thinking, perhaps not the most in-depth thinking, but at least my mind has been attending to something that I have been wishing to return to it in a way that would satisfy me. Return to it with the sufficient time that it needs to be thought through. And what I was thinking about was money, to a certain degree, about what money is, what it means. I was thinking about the different ways in which people visualize the world, or make sense of their experience. I was considering the economic approach and lens through which people understand the ebb and flow of human organization, how this affects governments, how this affects individuals, corporations, everything in between. And the word that had reminded me of that thought was the word pay. If you have nothing to pay. And I was struck when I was thinking initially about how limited we can be in terms of our understanding. our sciences have gotten so precise that, at least in the case of the economic, it seems that the aspects are so complex and so riddled with processes that are beyond what the average citizen would go to certain lengths to understand. And then, on the other hand, we have the broader whole that seems to be easy to conceptualize, but perhaps that's my own hubris. It seems to be easy in a sense because we can see what is coming or what is on the horizon. We don't necessarily need to understand the intricacies of the Federal Reserve or capital markets. Generally speaking, we can imagine the pawns on a map and see where they are going. We don't have to understand the particulars outside of the architecture. Or within the architecture, I should say. The architecture itself is sufficient to understand it. Now, the reason that I bring this up is not to say that precision is bad or that complexity is bad. It is more a matter of where the attention is placed. It is about the optimization of attention that I find interesting. Throughout my life and throughout, perhaps within my own mind, I should say, there is this glaring reflection, this self-judgment, that is, that my own organization, my mental organization, the way that I optimize my own attention is unfortunately saturated with distraction. It has gotten better as I've gotten older, but this thing that, people call attention deficit disorder, this umbrella term that kids are often medicated for, it seems as though there is a simple solution to it, and that is a practicing of a regular faith, a way of organizing one's attention towards some higher purpose. But it doesn't end. It is constant. It is that pursuit of attention that continually drives us. It is the absence of attention that we choose to flee from. I should say we choose to flee from it when we are faithful. And as a matter of faith, it matters what we pay attention to. It is the pursuit of one's faithful experience and faithful life to determine what it is that is the highest thing that they ought to be attending to. And for everybody, this has their own experience built into it. And I think by their own experience, their own unique experience, their journey is often unique. It's not to say that it cannot be shared, but their experience is their experience. And I bring that up because when I'm thinking about this precision, I think of almost like the head of a needle, how fine that is, how fine of a material object that is. And yet it is used to weave fabric together. Now, of course, it takes a long time to weave enough fabric together to produce anything useful. But nonetheless, the needle itself, the precision, is a means to an end. It is a means to understand the broader whole, the broader picture. Now, the picture that we use, if I am going to start this by using the initial lens of economics. This lens is an aspect through which this needle traverses and takes with it its thread. And it may cover a large area. Certainly, the history of human markets, exchange, money, this occupies a large component of his experience. This occupies an important piece of how he has come to organize himself with others. But surely, certainly, this is not the highest thing that we ought to be paying attention to. Much like the needle analogy that I had used, or the sewing analogy that I had used, it is more, the needle is important just as money is important, because it holds, it's like a tool, it holds value to meet some end. Money in and of itself has value because we say it has value. We use it as a tool in order to afford things for ourselves so that we can live the way that we want to live, so that we can love the way that we want to live. And part of this includes, necessarily, it must include our material existence, our material circumstance. And whether it be buying property, buying food, or buying medicine, money allows us to do all of these things. It allows us to transfer value from our desire, our wishes, to that which, at least in a free society, that desire, the effort, the will to produce something is then met again with the desire, let's say on my end, for some product, some piece of food, or some medicine. And that money is used as a storehouse, potential energy, the storehouse of value. And in the economic sense, we have all of these various institutions that seem to have a piece of trying to understand the complexity of our understand or control the complexity of our exchanges. I have tried many times to understand this business of interest. The business of interest, the business of the Federal Reserve. And it is not as though my mind is unable to understand on a certain level. I think it is. It is unwilling to commit it to memory because it doesn't understand it on another level, on the practical level, on the purposeful level, on the level of value. Because it is not optimal. It is certainly suboptimal, it would seem. Much like insurance companies are these bizarre intermediaries between one person who wishes to have a service met because they are suffering in some way, and the other person who possesses the skills to solve the problem that the other person is unable to solve. Instead of this direct communication, there is this intermediary. This intermediary is the face, the extension, the spirit of a larger institution that is there to gather resources and distribute it in such a way that allows this exchange to take place. But in a world that is sensible, it would seem reasonable that those who have the skills to treat those who require the skills would do so. It would also be sensible that since we live in this environment in which we need to exchange in order to subsist, that we don't have some other system of agreement by which we can offer services in exchange for food. There has to be a large organization apparatus that's responsible for this. The organization and apparatus that we have, the sacrifice that we have chosen, the agreement that we have made, is to have a centralized institution that collects monies, distributes some of them to itself, and also dispenses among various individuals as is needed. A form of collectivization, socialization that is outside of the bounds of government, which is quite satisfying to many Americans, but also stifling in the sense that the freedom that we are given is being abused by this relationship, it would seem. If you have nothing to pay, it's an interesting thing, an interesting statement. If you have nothing to pay, why should he take your bed away from you? In this matter of healthcare, it's not exactly the same analogy, it's not the same parallel, but there is some fundamental truth here that I think connects both of them. There is something about our agreements and our relationships. Again, I think this extends from prior verses. It is not just this verse that prompts me to consider this, but the extension of spirit over the other. With these senseless, or perhaps not senseless, there is some sense to be found in an insurance corporation, but perhaps it's just a veneer of it so that we are fooled into thinking that it is actually a practical organization. The dilemma that we have is a distribution of our attention, a distribution of our value that is far flung from the individual. It is given to those that we know nothing about. It is distributed by those of whom we know nothing about. I would not wish to claim that ourselves are the utmost important thing. There are plenty of things that are important outside of the self. But again, it's a matter of relationship. And the dissolving of attention and the distribution of resources and the continual passing on or deferment of responsibility is causing us to be sick. It is causing us to be behind on our obligations. If you have nothing to pay, I have to wonder, at what point do we ask ourselves, what are we paying for? No doubt there will be sensible answers to that question. But in light of considering the ultimate, the thing that we ought to be paying attention to, it would seem as though under this light we can see more clearly the aspects of our systems, our institutions, our organizations, aspects of ourselves that are just along for the ride, that don't really provide any value. And yet, because they have weaseled their way in like a parasite, they suck value out of the system. And it is not until people are reorganized or are alerted to the fact that what they are actually attending to is not practical. It is actually harming us in the long run. If you have nothing to pay, Why should he take your bed from under you? There are plenty of different areas that this goes into. In the sense of our current culture, it's extremely frustrating to reflect on this topic because our government, as it exists within our society, and our lineage from the conception of this nation, the United States, there are so many, it would seem, contradictions that the government would exist at all, given a free people and a free society. And yet surely there are sensible reasons for it. And yet as free people, as people that were desirous of their freedom in the first place so that they can worship freely, so that they could find that divine logos on their own terms rather than have it force-fed to them. If you have nothing to pay, then why should something be taken from you? And as I mentioned earlier about this economics example, there are plenty of things, there are plenty of ways in which man can transfer value. It doesn't have to be through the medium of money. There are many mediums. The medium for transfer of value can be behavior. It can be a hug, it could be a handshake, it could be a gesture, it could be a look. We are the creators of value. We create value, but we also are receivers of value. If you have nothing to pay, in a certain way, going back to this healthcare analogy, and reflecting on the prior verse for a moment, that surely it has something to do with this, but there is this sense, the role that the insurance company plays that is much like a guarantor. They are the sureties for the obligations of the individual to be able to procure or to produce enough value to exchange it for the services of an individual that would be able to help them with their health impairments. And I think there's definitely a case to be made that those who offer the services of health don't produce the type of value that is commensurate with the amount that they are asking for relative to the types of value that others make in their own lives for the jobs and professions that they do. Now, this is an impossibly complex interplay of value creation and distribution of monies, and I can't pretend to necessarily understand how to resolve this dilemma. But all the same, the relationship I think that we hold with these insurance companies is poor. It's a bit of a sin that we outsource so much value to these companies that do offer, I think, certain aspects of good service, but they participate in this system that is parasitical and greedy. Now I'll leave that behind for a moment because there's something about this exploration that doesn't necessarily 100% relate to the verse that is had here. I mentioned in some relation the American experience. And that there is this sense of self that ought to be free from unjust requirements or unjust obligations. if you have nothing to pay, then why would you be obligated to offer up an asset, which would be, in this case, the bed? A bed from under you, this is a larger symbol. This is a symbol that is, the bed is the place that you lay your head to rest. If we remove our bed, then we lay our head to rest on something that is much more uncomfortable, that we rest poorly. Now, if anyone happens to ever listen to this recording, I'm sure this is going to be, if it's not already, extremely frustrating to listen to or pay attention to, but this nothingness, I think, is an interesting way to use the word. I've been talking of nothingness often in the Proverbs, and how nothingness is this unstable sort of idea, this concept, that it's hard for me to understand how nothing can exist. And as I am prompted to consider here, that within this tradition, that there is the belief that there is prior intelligibility, this intelligibility that precedes the experience of man, and that his concept of nothingness, or rather that he is from nothing, is something that really doesn't follow reason. But used in this context, this nothingness is an absence of true obligation. So what nothing is being referred to here as something that is false. We can just as easily say, if you have false to pay, which doesn't really make any sense, but if we reorganize it, if you have been required, if you have been given an obligation, if you are obliged, if you are falsely obliged to pay for something, then what this actually is the equivalent for is no obligation. And that this concept of nothingness, it's a demonic sort of thing. It seeps in, demonic in the sense that within the mind of man there is this tendency to find value within falsehood, within the lie of this obligation. And we are saying that if we put a false obligation out into reality, and we expect it to be treated as though it is true, then conflict will arise. Disharmony will result. Remove not the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. Now this is a fascinating verse. This verse seems to be a departure from the series of verses that are prior. But, as I've said before, it's possible, I think, to interpret this with a degree of continuity, not only between the last few verses, but also throughout the whole chapter, and then, by extension, the book of Proverbs. But so far, my interpretation and my reading has been more of a verse-by-verse, individual sort of experience. And since this verse doesn't seem to have some prerequisite to understanding it, like a prior verse, I think it could be interpreted as a standalone. Remove not the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. I find this fascinating because we have never seen ancient landmark before in the Proverbs. And I think this is quite an important symbol. So what can we make of it? Although this is not something that I've seen before in the Proverbs, I think that this is one of those verses that seems to be relatively simple on the surface. But the meaning, or at least my apparent grasp of the meaning, is not quite brought to bear. Remove not the ancient landmark. So the significance of this landmark. I could ask the question, well, what is a landmark? And when I was younger, I used to use the word landmark to identify where I was. It was sort of my projection of the map of the environment, that if we passed by certain landmarks, I would know the way home. It didn't really depend on the coordinates to get me there. It didn't depend on the street signs. All I really cared about was particular landmarks. And then my mind seemed to remember the pattern of the roads as it wound through different places. Now, these landmarks had some significance. Again, they were the projection of my understanding, or rather, I projected onto them the axes around which my understanding of the environment rested. But they served a purpose in my young mind. It wasn't necessarily that I remembered them because I wanted to have this map of the environment. I remembered them because I wanted to know where I was in relationship to home. And that whether or not I was conscious of it at the time, I think I always understood at some level that the landmarks become salient when the concern for home is present. Now, it's quite something to extend this analogy out. The question is, well, how far does this analogy extend? How far is the proverb prompting us to think? Remove not the ancient landmark which your fathers have set. This type of landmark is something that is more meaningful. The type of home that we are considering here, or at least prompted to consider here, is not just an individual's home or a single family. This is a generational thing. This is an ancient landmark, is many generations. It is something of a foundational principle by which man can find himself home. But in the context of this verse, if we are to imagine that this landmark transcends many, many generations, and it is indeed built by our fathers, then it was likely set for some purpose. Unlike a landmark that I used when I was younger, I paid attention to it because it was prominent. But its prominence had nothing to do with me. Its prominence was independent of my salient landscape, I could say. That is to say, its existence was not necessarily related to, at least immediately related to, my purposeful interaction with it. But in the case of the father, that many generations ago had set up some physical place by which, almost like a lighthouse, but more sophisticated than a lighthouse, and I'll describe why in a moment, that this guides man back home. And I think the back home is interesting here because, much like when I was younger, back home meant a place of safety, security, but also love and family. A place of resting. A place of constancy. A place that is grounded amid the the unknown wild, let's say, by which I can only map different aspects of it, and I can't retain the whole picture. So I have to have these landmarks. But again, in the case of the Father, there is this intent by which something is built. I think of a temple, I think of a church, I think of an altar. And this ancient landmark it is more than just a symbol to guide our way home. It's a place that we stop at to participate. It is more than just this visual cue. It's an experiential medium by which we find value, meaning, establish strong relationships. And in this way, it is both a landmark in the physical sphere, but also in the heavenly domain. I think what may be particularly useful is to imagine what it would mean to remove such a landmark. If we go back to the simple illustration that I began with, if a landmark was removed, let's say this is something that was far on the periphery, so I only had specific understanding of maybe a red building or something. I wasn't too familiar with the roads or that which surrounded it, this landmark. If that thing was removed, and I found myself again out against this periphery, I would have no understanding of how to find myself back home. I would be lost on my own, under a new set of obligations. Obligations for which I had made, well, in the case of childhood, not so much, but in the case of my family, had made tremendous sacrifice to find some pillar of stability and constancy. Not necessarily that stability and constancy is primary, but it is certainly important. One of the fundamentals, prerequisites for raising a family, I think. But to remove, as I've mentioned, is to increase this uncertainty. The awareness of where one is in space is gone. To remove the ancient landmark that a loving Father had set would again mean that the connectedness, the bondedness of family and of home begins to disintegrate because we are no longer able to find the relationships that are necessary to form these bonds. We are unable to identify the surrounding area. We are unable to keep ourselves fixed to that place in the earth that perhaps at one time had a flourishing community. But it is an interesting question, isn't it? This idea, this aspect of creation, the burden placed on man, the capacity of man, the potential, the possibility, the materialization of potential when it happens, all of this wound up within the fundamentals of his place here. And although there are many experiences, there are many ways in which man can continue his experience. And there's always this talk of man at some point and perhaps his lineage or his family, his lot dying out. It is through the ages that man reinvents himself, it seems. In this reinvention, I have to imagine I have to consider that foundational experience. Man may go through many things, and yet he is still man. And that goes back to, well, what is he? Why is he here? What purpose does he serve? And if God is not that purpose for which he should serve, then what else would it be? It would be something lower. And so while he may learn by subordinate principles, the supraordinate ones are those that really bind his experience. They are the foundational aspects of his experience, of his existence. And I think of this in light of the story of Noah, when the animals are taken on board his ship during this profound time of change, for which all that he knew, all the world that had known up to that point, vanished. And it was he and his family that maintained the understanding and the wisdom of what was. And I'm sure during that experience, whether Noah was, a group of people, or he was truly this leader that re-envisioned and reimagined a society, regardless of his condition, and that is to say, not necessarily Noah in the sense of the story Noah, but I mean Noah in the sense of man's experience. This name, Noah, for which it has been defined in the Hebrew to rest, to comfort, to find relief or consolation in times of distress or chaos. And what is more chaotic than the way in which man orients himself to life, to the world, the thing that grounds him to sanity, the thing that separates him from the animals? What greater consolation does he have than the retention of mind and of human experience, especially in the face of its destruction or its absence? And here, if this is to be true, I think implies an interesting aspect of man's experience. How big, vast of a potential this experience is, both in terms of its lacking, but also in terms of its wonder. The ancient landmark, the external memory. See you a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings, he shall not stand before mean men. So this is the last verse in chapter 22. Let's see what we can make of it. See you a man diligent in his business? This is a question. A sentence simple enough. But of course, if we don't reflect on what the gravity of the statement means, or of the question, then we miss what is to come after. See you a man diligent in his business? What does it mean to be diligent in one's business? What does it mean to have business? So let's start with the word diligent. From the Latin, to esteem, to love. A compound of the word di in Latin, meaning thoroughly, and legere, meaning to choose or to pick out. And so here we see to thoroughly love, or to thoroughly pick out something, an aspect of precision, the quality of attention, the admiration of discipline. All of these things make up this diligence. A diligent person has found a purpose. And his business is that purpose. Purpose, that thing for which someone attends to. Purpose is God. Purpose is Lord. And so a diligent person, I think, is literally one that serves God, that serves the Lord, serves purpose. Now, of course, there are all sorts of gods out there, many inferior ones as well as superior to those inferior. And there's one that we conceptualize at the top, that we always chase, that we always try to emulate, or at least be in the good graces of. So now we have to remember we are asked the question, do you see a diligent man in his business? An interesting thing to reflect on. Immediately my eyes turn within, and there are some painful sights upon this landscape. The question, do you see a diligent man in his business? Perhaps right now I am. My business is the ultimate purpose, to serve. But of the hour that I will spend tonight, what of the other 24 that comprise this day? Of course, the necessary time in which I am asleep and not conscious, but what of the wakeful hours? How much of that experience have I been diligent in my business? What is my business, truly, if I spend 10, 11 hours of it working in an environment where I am an entirely different character, a different person? Now, I don't necessarily think in my case that this is true, but I do think that there is an element of me that is different when I am in my professional life and when I am doing this, and also in my poorer moments when I fall into inattentiveness and laziness, exhaustion. Now here I'll make a confession. It's such a bizarre thing, the mind. At once it wishes to be so involved with its experience and find the fullness of life, and at other times there is this pull, this drag towards superficiality, towards not doing anything meaningful, nothing practical. And I think many view this sort of thing as necessary, a necessary way to deflate or come down, relieve the pressure that one has built up during the working week. And I do think that there's an aspect of pressure release that is important, but certainly not all forms of pressure release. There's a deeper element that winds itself within the dissatisfaction of a current way of life. Again, it may not be in its totality, but that there is, woven within its fabric, a melancholic strand or two. And it's by these strands that we recognize that our purpose is not fulfilled. And in my experience, I can recognize a strand or two. They are not but few, unfortunately. But I have to remember the question, see you a man diligent in his business? What is it about these strands that I find distasteful? For certainly, although I'm asked the question, what I look for when I turn in is the diligent man. And of course, when I find him, I want to see all of him. I don't want to see parts of him. I want to see what that man looks like. The shadow over his face makes it difficult for me to come to know him. But of course, what I know must be seen are reflected in certain pursuits, but not in others. There are certain threads by which I can follow it. I can understand it. But by others, through which I am dejected and sent into despair. But of those that send me into despair, I find this continual process of awakening by which I choose it, but I also choose my suffering. The hardest pill, I think, for a person to swallow is the willful, guided destruction of their own lives. And of course, this might not be in totality. As I've mentioned, the life that I am confessing is not one that has completely sold its soul. There are plenty of elements that are redeemable and or redeemed. And I think we can go quite far with our own judgment that this sort of pull can exist at many different levels and in many different ways. Some strings of despair are much thicker or threaded and intertwined much more deeply. But of the degree to which I can understand my own experience and reflect on it, I know that this absence of attention to that which is truly important, to that which purpose that I am called, I know that if I do not live up to it, despite what other elements or aspects of myself may feel, and they may feel that the path or the road of life that is present is not the one that is most desirous, it is nonetheless the one that is here for me. It is the one that I walk. It is the one that we all walk. And although we may choose to take one branch in the path or other, it is not as though, if we imagine the path that we want, that we would get there without walking. The path requires us to be in it, to experience it, and to change as we need to accordingly to arrive at some destination that provides us with satisfaction so that we can sleep easy. That of myself, to the degree to which I can recognize that of my behavior that is good, I recognize the attentiveness, the discipline, the persistence, the pursuit. But it is always upon the the beginnings that I tend to stumble. It is not within. It is almost as if the beginnings are such and are meant to be the great test. As if we falter in their adolescence, we fail to see their maturity. We fail to desire that maturity. See you a man diligent in his business? He shall stand before kings. Stand before kings. The king, an interesting person of the ancient world. We have to, regardless of if we can appreciate his true standing or not, I think we have to respect what the king meant to an old society, or to society today. Some of the Middle Eastern countries come to mind here. A different way of living than the Western person is used to, even in the face of encroaching totalitarianism. Still quite different. Even in its most centralized forms, the West seems to be distributed. He shall stand before kings. That is, the head of state. The mind that is at the head of state, which invigorates culture, perhaps controls culture, directs the minds of many. It is this person who is diligent in their work that achieves some type of independence of thought, enough to be on the equal, or at least considered, attended to by this person that has such sway over a society and of a people. He shall not stand before mean men. So what first comes to mind here is the word mean. Now, the word mean has its roots in the French, which meant small, lessened. When I think of somebody that is mean, I think of them as being emotionally short, perhaps aggressive, but it is not a prerequisite. There's an aspect of their behavior that is not neighborly, it is not polite. Perhaps their sense of justice is skewed, it is off balance. There are many different ways in which we can classify a person as mean, but I think there is something about this interpretation from the Old French. This small or lessened. We just got off of talking about the king holding his high position in society. The mean man is the opposite. He shall not stand before mean men. It is the lowly man, it is the lessened man. I think it's easy for the modern person, the conscientious modern person, to feel a particular way about the potential for one that is of means, that is simple. And in a way, I think this is correct, because there are aspects of the simple that we would not wish to have in the high places. It is not to say that the simple are worthless, but rather, in the context of what we are saying, a man diligent in his business man that is very attentive in what he is doing, a man that is quite faithful to that which is beyond him, that highest thing, that which is beyond him. There are men that are simple, of simple mind, perhaps. We can qualify that in many different number of ways, or quantify it, IQ or pattern recognition, whatever. It doesn't really matter. It's almost as if we're talking about the fool, the wicked, and the evil, as compared to those who are outside of that selfish trap and that domain of addictive behaviors or self-corrupting behaviors. And so this is a positional issue. If a man is to show himself as a diligent person, he is necessarily above. He has taken a few steps towards heaven, I suppose we can say. And therefore, those on the lower rung, he doesn't stand before them. Now, I think this not standing before is an interesting way to conceptualize. If I am to stand before something, it is likely that I'm paying attention to that thing that I am standing before. I intend to interact with it. Now, I think that in a strict manner, this is what is being said here. But in the mind of what I think is just, I think adding the caveat of the man that is diligent in his business surely will not stand before that which is lesser, or the fool, or the wicked, or the evil. But also, to those that do not have the commitment or the faith, perhaps the level of faith, this is sticky territory, but I think that the important qualifier here is that regardless of the situation, if he has found himself a few rungs up the ladder, it is not as though he doesn't sacrifice his charity or his kindness. I think the standing before is a different type of relationship than the abandonment of pure attention or care. It's the abandonment of a certain type of care, much like we talked about earlier, about the extension of the spirit around the angry person or the furious person. This can be dangerous for us. Likewise, I think if we are dealing with somebody that ought to be given compassion, but if we are to intimately insert ourselves into the life of this person, their destructive habits or the way that they behave or they live can infect us, and we have to be careful. I think this is a standard psychological defense mechanism. But again, that does not negate the caring disposition or the commitment to lifting others up along with us, or facilitating the conversation that would allow two people together to ascend. Or in the case of the individual recognizing that he is lacking and wanting of spiritual wealth and understanding, he can pursue that which is above him in a respectful manner, in a caring manner, and he will likewise probably be treated as such. So that distinction I felt like was important to make. So this will conclude chapter 22. I will continue next time with chapter 23.